Hello and welcome to DigFin VOX, Voices in Digital Finance. I'm your host, Jame DiBiasio. If you enjoy the program, give us a like, share, subscribe, push that button. My guest today is Maaike Steinebach, founder of Femtech Futures, a Hong Kong-based VC that is investing and supporting a range of businesses involved in women's well-being and tech. We talked about the similarities between fintech and femtech, what she's doing in Web3, and the challenges as well as the opportunities of femtech in Asia. Maaike Steinebach, welcome to DigFin VOX.
Hi, good morning, Jame. How are you?
I'm great, and I'm great because I've got you on my show.
Yeah, awesome.
So I think we're going to have a super interesting conversation over the next roughly half hour, Maaike. So your background is impressive. Coming from a fintech perspective, you were doing digital work for Commonwealth Bank, and then you were running Visa for Hong Kong and Macau. So then you've moved on. You're also one of the key people on the FinTech Association creation of that in Hong Kong. So I'm following in your footsteps there. But now you're running your own thing called Femtech Futures, and we're going to talk about what that means, what's happening in this space, how that fits in with fintech and Web3. So my basic understanding of femtech as a term emerged only about, I think, 2016. It's attributed to another entrepreneur. She was making the equivalent of like a fitness tracker, but for menstruation rather than for like heart rate or something.
Correct.
And that kind of kicked it off. So you tell me what's happened to the concept of femtech in the past, let's call it 7 years.
Yeah, so thank you, Jame, for that. I got involved, kind of introduced to femtech when I was actually working in the Fintech Association. When I started to realize that there were actually a lot of women active in the technology space, but that weren't necessarily being very vocal about their presence. And when I created the Women in Tech group, I found that there were all different women working in technology in different areas, like health tech, fashion tech. And then when we started to talk about what that actually meant, particularly the women in the health tech, we're talking about some really interesting concepts of how we could actually democratize the well-being of women and basically meet their unmet needs by digitizing, let's say, the customer experience in healthcare. And I thought that was super interesting. Obviously, a lot of the original health tech space was very much focused on everybody. And if you look at femtech, really, the US and Europe have been running ahead of the pack. And I would say Asia has been catching up over the last few years. And we can talk about that later, why that is. But it is really now a concept to describe technology that helps democratize the overall well-being of women. And that can basically be their physical well-being, their mental well-being, and their sexual well-being. To a certain extent, you can also say their financial well-being.
You use the term democratization for this. We've heard this in fintech. It's a constant buzzword. What does it mean in the context for women's technology or women's well-being?
Well, it's basically giving women equal access to healthcare. So I think in Hong Kong and in Singapore, we are very lucky that we have very good access to healthcare, whether it's cheap through the public sector or whether it's more premium in the private sector. But if you look at areas like India or the Philippines or Indonesia, which are firstly much bigger and much widespread and much more rural, actually using technology very similar to fintech, actually, where you're looking to reach the unbanked communities. In femtech, you're looking to use this technology to focus on the underserved women that are in the healthcare space. So think about, for example, in India, if you need a mammogram in India, firstly, a mammogram machine, which is basically for breast cancer screening, just for people that don't know, but it's a $400,000 machine, and you can't just put it in the back of your truck. So there is a femtech in India that has recognized that you could use thermal imaging and a handheld gun to screen for breast cancer. So you can basically build a small booth, ask the women to undress, you scan with the thermal gun, you create a digital file, and hence, women have been screened for breast cancer. So it really helps get better access to healthcare for more women that was previously not accessible to them.
At Femtech Futures, you're serving, at least in part, as an investor, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So how does this compare to traditional, let's call it seed level venture capital? I assume we're talking seed or maybe Series A. I don't know where we're at in terms of the size of these opportunities.
Yeah, so I think what is interesting, as I mentioned earlier, so only about 14% of all the femtech companies today are coming out of Asia. So it's still very underdeveloped. However, there is research that shows that by 2026, Asia will be the largest region in terms of growth for women's health apps. So there is a lot of upside potential. So a lot of the companies that have set up have only been set up in the last 2, 3, maybe 4 years. There is a big difference, I would say, between the B2B kind of consumer facing and the kind of B2B space, where there is a lot of kind of deep tech and deep medical research involved, like cancer research, for example. It is the sector is very underinvested. Women's health is still considered a niche area, even though more than half of the population these days are women.
Quite a big niche.
Exactly, quite a big niche. But I also understand, right? So a lot of the topics here are not topics we talk about in our daily lives. I guess you're from a Western country. I'm originally from a Western country. It's a little bit easier. There is still a lot of stigma and taboo around women's health in a lot of countries in Asia. Hush hush when you talk about menstruation or menopause or even fertility problems. So I think what I'm trying to do is start up the conversation, bring a lot of these issues from the unconscious to the conscious, and try and create more awareness about these amazing companies that are out there that are really doing some great jobs. And it's very similar to what I was doing in fintech, also trying to connect them with the industry, because that's actually really amazing to see that when the fintech started, I think a lot of the establishment was like, are they going to disrupt us? What are they going to do? And we literally went from competition to co-opetition to collaboration, right? I think everybody now sees the benefit of collaborating with the fintechs and using the best of both worlds to kind of create a better customer outcome and solution. I think when you look at the healthcare sector, you really have the establishment, and then you have this new up and coming kind of technology for women. There is not a common path, I would say, for these two parties to find each other yet. And that's why I find it so interesting to use my experience in fintech to say, how can I use that to bring that path, to bring these companies on their path to meeting corporates, but also helping corporates in the industry to kind of connect with these fintechs to eventually create a better customer experience. And that could either be in the workplace, or it can really be in the B2C space.
What's the corporate landscape? How would you define that? What are these organizations?
Well, I think there's a bit of both. So on the one hand, you have the pharmaceutical industry that might be very focused on a vertical around birth control and are looking for horizontal expansion. Or you might be looking at corporates that are looking to introduce a women's well-being program for their employees, for example, because Femtech caters for both. Actually, there are different companies working on different solutions for different consumers. So yeah, that's what I mean by corporates.
I want to delve into this B2B versus B2C opportunity.
Sure.
On the one hand, they both have the pros and cons, I guess, which is true of anything. I would imagine that in the B2B world, you're dealing with perhaps more solid technologies, something that might be more of a differentiator, but a very slow process of getting that either a pharma or a hospital clinic group or something to onboard that. The B2C part, obviously, there's India alone has let's call it 600 or 700 million women, but how do you reach them, right? There's no one app that everybody follows. Nope. And people already there's already lots of health tech, insure tech, lifestyle apps, whether it's a super app or it's just everybody trying to do their own thing. So with these, how do you, so that addressable market as a VC, right? That addressable market, that growth, how are you placing your bets? How are you thinking about these problems?
Yeah, so I think what is interesting is in the B2B space, what you're seeing a lot is a subscription model. So basically a corporate subscribes to a well-being program or to a period care product, which is purely like any other app is a subscription-based model, a SaaS model. Yeah, sorry, I was looking for the right word. I think in what we're seeing in the B2C space, you're right. So there's a lot of kind of global apps that are available for your mental well-being, but because some of these problems are also related kind of to how governments are approaching it. So I'll give you an idea. There's a really interesting app in the UK, which is called Pebby, which is basically for employee well-being, and it's a one-stop shop where you can ask all questions, both men and women, by the way. But it is heavily it's only available in the UK because it is also heavily driven by government policy around maternity leave or paternity leave and menopause conversations that are happening.
So it just can't ever scale out of that because it's so policy specific.
Exactly. So what is interesting is a lot of corporates would look for like an intra-regional solution, like a one size fits all, but that's very difficult to customize because of the local nuances. And I think particularly in Asia, also because of the cultural nuances, it's really going to take a while before we get there. So what you're seeing is localized solutions. But interestingly enough, there you also see, there might be companies in Singapore that provide subscriptions for birth control and for STI, so for sexual transmissible diseases or UTI that are done online. And they are now creating a reach into, for example, India and Indonesia, because the women are finding that they can't find these solutions in countries. So they're actually going online into Singapore for some of those solutions. So I think slowly but surely, there is a real need to come up with a regional solution. And I think the providers, the Femtech companies are becoming smarter and looking how they can expand into those different markets. But it is a little bit of a localized approach for now, unfortunately, still.
How do you create awareness around these B2B solutions that are strictly focused around women's health or well-being issues, as opposed to an investor or a corporate that will say, oh, well, I've got this overall health solution and this would just be one part of it, and you end up getting lost in the mix, or is that actually the way to go? You platform off of a more general population thing, and you are just a widget perhaps, but at least you're there and you've got that distribution.
Well, firstly, you know me. I think it's really important that this is not about kind of singling out women's health as kind of, the most important place in the workplace. I mean, there is definitely a dialogue that is needed that includes both men and women in this space. But the reality is that 66% of all healthcare problems relate to women, and men have a much smaller percentage. So the reality is that a lot more women bring their health issues into the workspace. That's number one. Number two, also following COVID, it has become quite apparent that employees are actually expecting their employers to kind of take care of their well-being, right? So it started with masks and sanitizers and and some gym equipment, maybe at home or some home office. But I think that has now become a bit of usance where employees are looking at how can my employer support me on my well-being journey. And honestly, there is data that is now being created through all these programs, which shows, particularly around mental well-being, that there is a big demand from employees for these kind of services, and also for employers a real need to focus on this. But what is interesting is you can't do a one size fits all. So I think all these programs, the ones that are going to be really successful going forward, are the ones that can actually commoditize kind of the back end but personalize the front end, which again is very similar to what was happening in fintech, right?
Yeah.
So it's
yeah, thanks. That's a great explanation, Maaike. I want to maybe bring it back to fintech, if you don't mind. Just get a sense of, obviously, there's a financial side, an insurance side, a savings and investment side. There have been attempts in the fintech world at sort of women-focused investment products, for example. I think a very mixed record on those. What are some of the? We've talked about some of the takeaways from fintech, but to what extent does Femtech embed itself into fintech solutions? Are you seeing any movement along that line?
So I think firstly, we talk a lot about kind of the fem economy, right? So women are half of the population. They're becoming older and older, and to a certain extent also richer, because women are entrepreneurs in their own right, but they might also inherit money from their partners. So they are becoming wealthier, and they really want to grow old kind of gracefully. So they have money in their pocket to kind of spend. So keeping that in mind, I think from a financial services perspective, this is still a really interesting target market. Whether those solutions should be tailored only towards women, but I think financial education and some of the work that Sophia is doing, making sure that financial literacy in general goes up for women, I think is very, very important. What we are seeing, though, particularly as it pertains also to the health tech space, is a lot of the treatment there is still exclusive, might not be covered by insurance. So what I'm now seeing is actually the fintechs now being embedded in the femtech to actually create an all-in solution. So basically, you get a solution for fertility, but you also get financing for that, for example.
Okay, so you become the consumer-facing. You're the consumer-facing or the client-facing service,
correct.
And people are trying to embed themselves into you, data share, and all that.
Yes, correct. So, and I think the data share that you mentioned is very, very important, because I've also realized that a lot of corporates or consumers, they also they want data now to track their progress, right? Whether it's with your Fitbit or on your own well-being and fitness track, but also as an employer to keep track of your well-being. So connecting the two and making that traceable, I think is really interesting to see.
In the fintech world, particularly in Hong Kong these days, Web3 is a big topic. Probably not in the US or Europe, but we're seeing, because the regulators are really pushing it, we're seeing a lot of activity here, and it can stretch the range from regulated, licensed virtual asset exchanges to stable coins to the potential of central bank digital currencies and all through that. So, but let's just say the concept of the idea of Web3 is kind of similar to what you're trying to do, I guess. I don't know if it actually works in practice, but the idea that people have some sort of sovereignty over their data, and that when they deal with the internet companies of the future, you have both a value exchange as well as information exchange that's running on whether it's blockchain or some other kind of rail, and you've got this idea that there's some level of individual sovereignty over your information rather than giving it all to some giant San Francisco company. So
yes.
Where do you fit in with this, and do you see this as something that you are you investing in any companies that are sort of in this Web3 kind of fuzzy mandate?
So I think a few things. So I think a digital identity for healthcare is super important. So I was recently in the US where I attended, actually was on a panel for a kind of sexuality in Web3. And one of the discussion points that we had was, your physical persona is going forward going to be almost similar in Web3, because these days there's a lot of suits, these suits that the gamers wear, so that when you get kind of hit or shot. Yeah, I forgot, not the skin, I forgot the name, but actually you can feel the pain. You get stabbed, you feel the pain, for example.
Oh, okay, not a skin online.
No, not an avatar.
An actual physical thing that you're wearing.
Exactly, a physical thing, so that you can, so when you're in a game, whether you're shot or you're stabbed, you actually feel that to a certain extent. Well, that also means that, I could potentially physically harass you in Web3. And there is no guidance, no rules as to what that means for the physical body actually in Web3 going forward, when we are now thinking as a digital persona. But what if you can actually feel and touch and experience everything you experience in the physical world, but also in Web3? So really interesting companies and startups that are working in this space, and I think a very necessary conversation that needs to happen about how do we treat that, and how do we think about that. So I think that's one side. I think the other side is also how you can protect your property. So again, I think a lot of the conversation that is happening in Web3 is maybe on gaming or on securities, but this is really about people's physical assets. So people that may be sex workers that have images that they want to kind of control in a way. Some really interesting startups working in that space. But even closer to home in Hong Kong, I'm invested in a company that's called Breathtronics. So basically they do well-being in Web3. And they have just launched, they already had an app, but they've just launched a token and an app which you connect to unlock more modules to kind of help with your well-being through breathing techniques. So super interesting kind of new ways of looking at well-being in Web3. And I'm super excited to see what comes out of that.
Gamification's been a topic in fintech. I think it's sort of got a bit of a bad reputation because it turned into basically just casino-like mechanics. But is gamification also part of a femtech movement?
Yes, thank you, because I forgot to mention that. Yes, absolutely. So I think particularly for educational purposes, so you are now seeing, for example, a menstrual period care startup that has created a whole experience in Web3 for teenagers to kind of gamify themselves through this workshop, which previously might have been done in school, very, one-dimensional, and is now kind of multi-dimensional in Web3. So I think the gamification for education purposes, particularly in health tech, could be very, very interesting. And particularly when you do this around taboo topics, right? If you gamify it and make it accessible for everybody, that could be really interesting.
What is so that leads me to, I guess, the last question here, or last topic, Maaike, which is we are both in Asia. The mores here vary from one place to the next. Some cultures here are quite conservative. Of course, I'm from the United States. I mean, we could talk about abortion bans being passed in many of the southern states. So this is not unique to Asia, but certainly here we do have some countries are majority Muslim. They might have their own take on this. Other countries like China are not only inherently quite, traditional and I'd say male dominated in their outlook, but also they're dealing with fertility problems, and perhaps they have a different view about what kind of women's care or women's education is important to them compared to somebody from the West. So what are you finding in terms of, what is the same, what is different, and do you find yourself having to push up against or get pushed back against, maybe just one or two anecdotes in terms of how you're navigating these different cultures?
Yeah, so I think just coming back to the analogy of fintech, I think when fintech started, there was a lot of pushback just because it's something different. So I feel that similar with femtech, there is still a bit of pushback around should we actually put health in general, on a technology platform or a technology play. And you're absolutely right. Culturally, there are a lot of differences. So yes, there are Muslim countries, but equally, you have countries like the Philippines that are very religious as well. and are very, focused on, not contraception is an issue. So I'm finding actually what I'm finding particularly interesting is that a lot of the younger women I talk to, they really want to encourage change, and they really want to encourage collaboration in this space. So they're very grateful to me. They come to me either online or they come to me face to face to say, we're very happy and super excited that you're tackling some of these problems, because we really, really want to see that change. Because we come, particularly younger women, come from a generations where their parents might never have spoken about their well-being, wouldn't have spoken about things like sexual topics, sexual wellness. They are now becoming parents or thinking about becoming parents, and they just want to create a better experience. So overall, I'm finding the response from the women I interact with very, very positive. But I'm not finding a lot of pushback. It's just, this is an area which, you can't be an elephant in a porcelain cabinet. You need to take it step by step. So I'm trying to be quite gentle in the way I approach this, and not be confrontational, but really be collaborative, and really show, on the one hand, the commercial opportunity to the VCs and for the people that are in the business to say, hey, this is really good for your business, but really for the users and for the governments to show this could actually be a really good opportunity, because economies that focus on women are actually thriving. So yeah, make it an opportunity instead of a challenge.
I think that's a great place to end our conversation, Maaike. Thank you so much for joining me on DigFin VOX.
Thank you so much for having me, Jamie. Good luck.